Fellowship of the Broken, Making Sense of 12-Step Recovery by Angelo. Chapter 21. Self-Contemplation. The next practice to look at is the regular use of self-contemplation or self-inquiry. The earlier stages of the inner journey described in the previous chapter generally come about through meditation, yoga and prayer. The remaining stages require a deeper exploration of our own true nature. When meditation, yoga and prayer are undertaken by the personal self, there tends to be a feeling of a me that is undertaking the practice and an it that we are personally trying to experience, unify with, or pray to. We are still in the world of duality. Once the balance of identity between human and being shifts past the 50-50 stage, then we are entering into the realm of non-duality. It's not just that we come to realize that the me is simply a condensed, restricted form of consciousness, but we also increasingly identify our actual existence as consciousness rather than me. This tipping point cannot just be taught or learned from a book. It has to be experienced, and such experience comes about through self-contemplation. Two main obstacles arise in this respect. Firstly, we can find it impossible to believe that our own true nature is that of consciousness. It seems too good to be true from the perspective of the personal ego mind, and our own brokenness seems to confirm that we cannot possibly be that which gives rise to happiness, peace, love and unity. Secondly, there can be a strong sense of fear when we come face to face with surrendering the personal ego self. We're happy to practice meditation, yoga and prayer, but when it comes to actually letting go of personal self-interest, then we instinctively pull back. The ego mind is rooted in survival, and this survival instinct kicks in automatically. This obstacle arises because the personal mind is still identified with itself as itself. The survival instinct is natural and necessary for the continuation of the individual life, but letting go of the personal ego mind does not bring life to an end. Ironically, it's when we die to our personal ego minds that life really begins. Self-contemplation or self-inquiry originates from the Jnana school of yoga and is known as Jnana Vichara or Atma Vichara. It's also a key part of the eighth limb of the previously mentioned Raja Yoga. Although ancient in origin, this practice became more accessible in the West through the teachings of one particular individual in the first half of the 20th century. Bhagavan Sri Ramana Maharshi is one of the most famous of India's spiritual masters. Following his own self-realization in 1896, at the age of 16, he journeyed to the sacred mountain of Arunachala at Tiruvannamalai in Tamil Nadu, where he lived and taught until his death in 1950. The following quote is the essence of his teaching. Quote, "When other thoughts arise, one should not pursue them, but should inquire, to whom do they arise? It doesn't matter how many thoughts arise. As each thought arises, one should inquire with diligence, to whom has this thought arisen? The answer that would emerge would be, to me. Thereupon, if one inquires, who am I? The mind will go back to its source, and the thought that arose will become quiescent. With repeated practice in this manner, the mind will develop the skill to stay in its source." Close quote. His use of the word mind relates to consciousness rather than just the personal intellectual mind arising in the brain. The source of mind or consciousness that he refers to is the same source or emptiness that we have covered in previous chapters. The idea that universal mind resides at source is central to the understanding that consciousness exists behind and before the concept of the self-identified personal me and the intellect. Consciousness gives rise to the personal ego mind, rather than just being a product of our biological existence. Consciousness, or awareness, exists prior to birth, is present throughout our lives, and continues to exist after our death. Consciousness appears to us to be focused at the point of the personal body-mind, ego, identity and intellect, which it is, but it also exists at a personal non-physical level, known as the Atman or soul, and also at a non-personal universal level, known as Supreme Self, Param Atman or Christ consciousness. Beyond this is the source of consciousness itself, known as Absolute, Source, Ultimate Truth, or Brahman. These distinct categories of consciousness imply a separation from one level to the next, but this is not the case. The key to grasping spiritual principles is an understanding that it is all one consciousness, simply vibrating at different densities. This is also the gateway to comprehending the spiritual solution to addiction, as we shall see later. If we conceive of the personal ego mind vibrating at a dense, low vibration of consciousness, then each subsequent level can be conceptualized as increasing in vibration and brightness. The body-mind ego identity would be dark and dense. The soul would be much brighter and lighter. The Supreme Self would be a brilliant, dazzling, ethereal light, and the Absolute would be infinitely luminous and beyond description. In the same way, a low vibration of consciousness can be seen as fearful, with the higher levels moving towards love, unconditional love, and ultimately to infinite love. Given that we already are operating to a greater or lesser extent at the level of personal body-mind ego identity, then it's perfectly logical to conclude that the other higher levels of consciousness must also be present. The fact that we are aware of our existence must mean that consciousness exists, and hence we must be able to access the levels above. This is not a deeply mystical theory, but a simple, rational conclusion. The first move is to dispel the illusion that we are our bodies. There's a general cultural preoccupation with physical appearance, and we tend to give a lot of attention to clothing, hairstyle, makeup, body shape, and the like. Looking in the mirror every morning tends to reinforce the idea of identification with the body. However, it's obvious that today's body is very different from the body in childhood. The sense of I remains, but the body changes over time. In fact, the body is changing from moment to moment with all manner of biological activity. The sense of I obviously arises in the mind rather than the physical body. So having dispelled the myth of bodily identification, we can now turn our attention to which level of consciousness we do identify with. Using the practice of self-inquiry, as suggested by Ramana Maharshi and many other subsequent teachers, it is possible for any of us to access and experience being the higher levels of consciousness. This process is based on the logical and irrefutable fact that anything that I can see or perceive cannot be me. I am not my car, for example. Well, this is pretty obvious, as indeed is anything else external to us. And this also applies to the various labels that we use to describe ourselves. I might say that I am an accountant, but that would be the personal ego self making this statement, rather than the underlying consciousness. The fact that I, consciousness, can perceive that I, ego, is an accountant must mean that the true I is the witnessing consciousness rather than the accountant. The consciousness exists behind the ego identity and is aware of the ego through observation. This can all seem a bit confusing to begin with, but persistent self-contemplation will quickly reveal the truth. The same logic applies to all thoughts, images, emotions, sensations, and sensory perceptions. All of this is perceived in awareness, and hence none of it is the true identity. The personal ego identity is itself a psychological construct that is observed from the position of personal consciousness or personal awareness. Once this awareness is experienced and established through practice, then we are at the level of personal spirit or soul. Having become the observing witness of thoughts and feelings from this position of deeper personal consciousness, then it becomes apparent that we are also aware of being this witness. Using the same logic as before, it must be the case that there is a deeper level of consciousness that is aware of this personal awareness. This deeper awareness is still identified as I, but is now at the level of pure consciousness, which is no longer personal, but instead observing the personal consciousness from a non-personal position. A period of practice will probably be needed in order to become familiar with identifying as non-personal consciousness. It may take months, or years, or it may be more immediate, but eventually the opportunity arises to address the major obstacle that I have encountered. There is an awareness of consciousness, but it's not possible to use universal mind to perceive it. Such perception can only come about by letting go of consciousness entirely, and hence being the source. This is the source of universal mind, or source of consciousness, referred to by Ramana Maharshi and referenced by many others. This is the ultimate truth of our being. Identification with inner levels of being through self-inquiry is so important because a life experienced from such deeper perspectives is far more serene and blissful than we may have previously thought possible. If all of our identity is focused at the level of personal ego, then such attention will give so much attachment and power to our thoughts and feelings that suffering will inevitably arise. This reflects the first two noble truths of Buddhism, which in essence firstly say that suffering exists, and secondly that suffering arises from attachment to desires. If, on the other hand, our identity is focused at the level of pure consciousness, or even at source, then our perspective is non-personal. In this case, our apparently personal thoughts and feelings will have far less impact and power. We will become detached from personal desires and happy to accept and enjoy life just as it is. This reflects the third and fourth noble truths of Buddhism, which suggests that suffering ends when attachment to desire ceases, and that such freedom from suffering is possible by following the Buddhist Eightfold Path, or, generally speaking, a spiritual path. This explanation of freedom seems so simple, yet it is evidently beyond the grasp of the majority. For many of us, we are never really exposed to a deep understanding of such wisdom, and hence it never occurs to us that such a transformation is possible. Some do have a good understanding, but still find it very difficult to experience freedom for themselves. Others may have experienced momentary or periodic freedom, but then find it impossible to maintain this in everyday living. We tend to think of progress in terms of achievement, but the spiritual path is much more about letting go of old ideas, behaviours and identity, rather than attaining something new. As previously mentioned, the higher levels of consciousness are already present. Progress is about detaching and letting go of the lower illusory levels, and thereby automatically identifying at higher levels. It's not about achieving something preferable or becoming a better person, but about returning to our true nature. It's all about the revelation of our true selves, or self-realization. This idea of letting go is often not attractive to the personal ego mind, nor is it culturally popular, and hence we tend to resist it at all costs. There are many potential ways to try to visualize and explain why self-realization is so problematic. My own preferred conception is one where the personal spirit and ego are seen as a lens through which the light of consciousness shines. Each lens is unique, hence giving rise to an individual personality and experience of life, but the lens is opaque or clouded over. This opaqueness distorts the nature of reality into an incomplete or limited experience. In order to see reality as it truly is, the lens needs to be crystal clear. The Advaita Vedanta of Hinduism is based on the non-duality of consciousness. This approach proposes a model for the personal spirit and the ego, which, although very simple compared to the science of psychology, does offer some understanding of the mechanics of consciousness at these levels. They use the word antakarana as their label for the two-part lens, and then causal for the level of personal spirit or soul, and subtle for the level of ego. It's worth remembering that overall this is one single consciousness, so these levels are really indistinct partitions rather than actual levels. The causal level, or soul, is conceived of having two aspects. The first is samskara, which holds a psychic blueprint in the form of talents, powers, impressions, tendencies and habits. This aspect is inherent and also develops through experience and repetition. It can be seen as a coloured film that gives rise to our personality, perception and behaviour. The second aspect at the causal level is known as the three gunas. These are forces or energies that combine to produce diversity of action. The first guna is called rajas, and this relates to the energy of activity in our daily lives. The second is tamas, which is the energy of passivity and inertia, giving rise to the need for sleep and rest. And the third guna is known as sattva and is best described as the quiet, happy, blissful energy of being that is present in moments of peak experience and felt as inner warmth and contentment. The subtle level, or ego, is comprised of four functions. The first is manas, which is the registering and desiring aspect of the mind. The purpose of manas is to gather experience from the outside world. Then we have the memory function, chitta, that stores the incoming experiences. The third is called buddhi, and this is the intellect or discriminating aspect of mind. This checks that the desires arising from manas are useful to our being and also files away incoming learning in the chittas. The final function at the subtle level is called ahamkara. This is the all-important sense of identity. This can range from I am the body at one end of the spectrum to I am pure consciousness at the other end. Each of us will be at a point somewhere on this spectrum at any given moment. So in summary, we have four components of personal mind at the level of soul: samskara, rajas, tamas and sattva, and four parts at the ego level: manas, chitta, buddhi and ahamkara. The potential combinations of these 8 elements create the multiplicity of individuality. All of them are dynamic, hence our experiences and perceptions are constantly changing. These 8 moving parts form the lens of antakarana through which the light of pure consciousness shines and thus creates unique experiences of life. All of it arises from and is part of pure, non-personal consciousness, and all of it is observed by pure, detached awareness. The keys to cleansing the lens of antakarana are firstly to focus on activities that create an abundance of sattva, and secondly to use the buddhi intellect to expand the ahamkara from the limited personal ego identity to the true underlying reality of pure consciousness. One of the main differences between Eastern philosophy and general Western belief is the concept of reincarnation. Hinduism and Buddhism place great emphasis on the idea that the causal level, or soul, continues to exist after death of the physical body. The cessation of brain activity would bring an end to the ego identity at the subtle level, but the personal soul would remain available to be reincarnated into a subsequent period of life. The objective of life would be to purify the lens of antakarana, and if this were not achieved, then a further lifetime would arise to continue the process. This provides some degree of explanation for near-death experiences and past life recall, for which there is plenty of anecdotal evidence. It also gives some insight into the idea of karma, whereby actions impact the samskara blueprint and hence influence future experiences. This would imply actions from previous lifetimes impacting this current one, and also current actions having an effect on this lifetime and future ones. All of these concepts can also be explained by our whirlpool metaphor, whereby energies released from previous whirlpools combine downstream to produce new ones. This would suggest that a new soul would not be a precise reincarnation of a previous life, but instead would contain traces of one or more previous lives embedded in the samskara blueprint. I mention this because it does offer a possible partial explanation for why addiction arises in some individuals but not in others. It may, of course, simply be the outcome of childhood conditioning or repetitive behaviour. It may, however, be genetic inheritance or samskara from a previous life, or perhaps it could be that pre-existing samskara impacts the genes in some way. Many of those suffering from addiction come from challenging backgrounds where one or both parents are addicts or they have experienced childhood trauma. But I've also met people in recovery who have no family history of addiction or trauma, but suffer nevertheless. There are those who witness addiction from parents or family members and make a firm decision not to follow suit, only to find in later life that somehow they have done just that. I've spoken with others who have been adopted at an early age and grown up in a nurturing environment, but have then become addicts and later discovered that there is a history of addiction in their biological family. There is clearly a combination of nature, nurture and repetitive behaviour in addiction. Introducing the idea of samskara does offer an explanation for how this self-destructive impulse arises seemingly randomly in some people but not in others. Perhaps the addiction is intended to somehow lead us onto a spiritual path, then letting go of personal identity and eventually to freedom. There is a lot of information to absorb here, and much of it probably differs from our preconceived ideas. All I can say is that it makes sense to me, and the model has the benefit of being able to explain things in simple terms. There are many other frameworks and theories, and the complexity makes it all rather challenging to understand. This model is based on the idea that there are two levels within the personal self, which ties in nicely with the concept of the conscious and subconscious mind. When I first started out on this journey of spiritual discovery, I related only to my ego identity and a single personal mind, although often with conflicting internal voices. What has become increasingly apparent through a combination of study and practice is that these voices arise from different levels of consciousness. It's also clear that these apparent levels are a single consciousness, which is simultaneously personal and impersonal, and is both the product of creation and its source. Consciousness itself is increasingly becoming the subject of scientific study and research. There are numerous published papers and even international academic conferences organised by the Center for Consciousness Studies based at the University of Arizona. In a recent paper published in the Journal of Neuroquantology, physicist Nassim Haramein and others at the Resonance Science Foundation proposed the concept of a Unified Space Memory Network, or USN. This model results from the emerging scientific understanding that information and geometry are fundamental to the nature of space, time, energy, and matter. The underlying physics and mathematics are mind-blowingly complex, and the conclusions are far-reaching. In simple terms, 5 key points emerge. Firstly, that the constants of nature at the outset are not arbitrary or random, but are defined by specific ratios and relationships. Secondly, that the inconceivably minuscule subatomic architecture of space-time, known as Planck scale, contains information that is self-ordering and self-organizing. Thirdly, that there are communication paths at this Planck level, facilitating the sharing of information across space-time, hence giving rise to memory, responsiveness and adaptability. Fourthly, that each level of matter arising from Planck scale all the way through to our material world builds on the level below and adds to the available information. And finally, that over time, this inevitably results in living organisms with increasing orders of individual consciousness and ultimately to species of self-aware, sentient beings. So USN explains consciousness at multiple levels and cosmological evolution from the Big Bang right through to today. It also implies a purpose to evolution, which would presumably be for the originating source to become self-aware and to be able to experience its own diverse physical manifestation. This is just one theory, of course, but it does again show how science and broad spiritual principles are converging. As the most advanced species on this planet, USN would imply that humankind is at the leading edge of evolution, not just physically and intellectually, but also in terms of consciousness. We have the ability to look outwards and be creative, but also to look inwards and to discover deeper and more expansive experiences of consciousness. We are effectively the ultimate expression of the Source, and a mechanism through which Source experiences its own creation and itself. This gives real purpose to our lives, and it also moves self-inquiry from being perceived as an esoteric, old-school spiritual practice to being fundamental to our very existence. Ramana Maharshi knew much of this, not through study or scientific research, but through his own experience of enlightenment. Many others have had similar experiences throughout the ages. The dualistic thinking of the personal ego mind turns such people into idols and translates their teaching into yet another spiritual tradition or religion. In truth, they were, and still are, all saying the same thing in a variety of languages and cultural settings. Our personal ego minds then interpret these various belief systems as different and contradictory, rather than as a basis for unity and wisdom. A very perceptive observation from Albert Einstein is that, quote, "No problem can be solved from the same level of consciousness that created it." Close quote. We see this being demonstrated as true in many aspects of our world today, yet we still think that we can solve problems from the level of personal ego identity. Self-inquiry and the discovery of our own true nature through personal experience is, for me, the most important activity that any of us can possibly undertake. In many respects, it's the only thing that really matters, because all else is just transient vibration in the eternal moment of now. Just as a sophisticated smartphone application arises from and comprises complex layers of logic based on binary code, so are each of us individually sophisticated beings arising from and comprised of complex layers of consciousness. The wonderful opportunity provided by spirituality is to experience being this consciousness and thereby obtain freedom from the inevitable suffering of a life based only on personal ego identity. There are many spiritual practices that lead to enlightenment, but self-inquiry is the most potent and direct. Setting aside time for self-contemplation is an important aspect of spiritual progress. It can be practiced alone, but self-inquiry tends to be more powerful when practiced in groups.